Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 361. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well. And Connor, we work at the Libertarian Institute, and this is a great organization that was founded and directed by Scott Horton. We have Sheldon Richmond, James Bovard, Lori Calhoun, and a bunch of other great writers on staff. And we have a brief word from our founder, Scott Horton, on our current fundraiser.
Hey, you all, it's fundraising time again at the Libertarian Institute. We try not to do this to you too often, but business is business after all. I got a great group of guys and a gal at the Institute, and I got to pay them. So just go to libertarianinstitute.org/donate to pick your price and help out. We've got some great kickbacks too, books and shirts. Great ones. That's libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thank you all very much.
All right, Connor, so if everybody wants to just help us keep going, help us doing what we're doing here, keep making the show better, writing more articles, then head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation and support. And as always, if you need some CBD products, check out Paloma Verde. When you use the promo code PEACE at palomaverdecbd.com, again, the promo code is PEACE, P-E-A-C-E. They'll save you 20% and get the show a kickback. All right, Connor, let's get into the news today. And the first story I want to talk about is the war in Yemen, which, this is something I need to get better about. Has just kind of fallen off the radar in this past year, as the show has really almost exclusively at times covered the war in Ukraine. And I think that, has been important in that we have a really unique and important perspective here at Conflicts of Interest about the war in Ukraine. But at the same time, these wars in the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, Connor's fortunately been here to update us on the Iran nuclear deal, but some of this just hasn't gotten the amount of coverage that it deserves, and certainly nowhere near the amount of coverage that we gave these wars in the past. And so I want to talk briefly about the war in Yemen to start off the show today, Connor. There has been a ceasefire in Yemen for most of the year, and so in some way the fact that we haven't been talking about Yemen reflected don't want to say good news, but not bad news, which is almost always what had been the topic when it came to Yemen. It was just, more people are dead, more starvation, more death, more destruction, more war. And that has really been scaled back since April, where there was an agreement between the Houthis and then the government of Yemen that's backed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that government is really propped up by those states, and so they really are, those governments, that those Saudi Arabia and the UAE really do make up the Yemeni government. And direct what it says, they have cut a deal with the Houthi government that represent about 80% of the Yemeni population live in Houthi-held territory. So that was really significant and really important and held for quite a long time. Now that has fallen apart, but Connor, fortunately, the fighting that has resumed in Yemen has been, from what I've seen, almost all ground fighting. There's no Saudi air support for their forces, their jihadist-backed forces, the jihadi forces like the Giants Brigade that the UAE supports. And from the Houthi side, they haven't been carrying out attacks inside Saudi Arabia. And the amount of, commodities, fuel, food, medicine, things like that getting into Yemen isn't at the level that it needs to be, but it isn't as desperate as it was, say, 2-3 years ago, according to people, who have been involved in what's happening in Yemen. So this article here is from Dave DeCamp, and this seems to be some positive news. Dave writes, the Senate is expected to vote on the Yemen War Powers resolution this week, and it could be brought to the floor as soon as Tuesday. And we now know that the vote is actually expected. As soon as the show comes out, everybody, the vote should be within just a couple hours of that time, and then we're going to know exactly what's happening here. But it is expected that this vote is going to happen tonight. If the bill is passed, it's going to end U.S. support for the Saudi Arabia war and the blockade on Yemen that has, as Dave mentioned, killed at least 377,000 people. Although I imagine when we look at excess deaths, we're if not at a seven-figure number, approaching that at this point. So Senator Bernie Sanders is bringing forward the bill and said the resolution will be on the floor, and he believes it has enough votes to pass. Although Americans need to really, if you're listening to this right now as it's live or something, go ahead and dial 1-833-STOP-WAR to get connected with your senators and urge them to support the resolution. I actually called one of my senators earlier today. I'm going to call the other one right after me and Connor get off. I figured I'd make a last minute call if somebody's sitting on the fence or anything like that. If your senators are already co-sponsors or something like that, that's great. Just call the office and say they're doing a good job. If your senators are on the fence about it, you could bring up the fact that the Saudis killed a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, and they have essentially gotten away with that at this point. That continuing the war in Yemen was something that Joe Biden pledged to end when he was on the campaign trail. Or, just bringing up that Joe Biden is continuing a war that was started by Barack Obama, and it's been to the great benefit of the, most extreme elements and factions within Yemen. And so all this, Connor, is extremely problematic. And, the best thing that could really happen at this point is, to get this Yemen Wars Power resolution passed. So Dave goes on to write, the resolution has strong support from the Democrats in the Senate, but according to the activist group Demand Progress, Senator Rand Paul is the only Republican to come out publicly in favor of the resolution. Senator Mike Lee of Utah may also support the bill, but has led previous efforts to end the war in Yemen. So particularly right now, if you're listening to this live and you live in Utah, give Mike Lee a call because his support could be critical here. I read today, Connor, I think you saw this as well, that the White House has come out against this resolution. And so what I don't know. I'm keep it family friendly here, so I can't use the adjectives I want to describe Joe Biden at this point, but an awful coward who is going back on some of his most important campaign pledges to, hold Mohammed bin Salman accountable for the murder of an American journalist, and to end the war in Yemen. The few things that Biden said he was going to do that we actually support, he's falling through on. So, the old Scott Horton rule of whoever gets elected is going to do all the bad things they promise and none of the good ones, certainly playing out here, Connor. But just again, anybody who can give a call and support, if you're calling a Republican, make it out to be this is Biden's war, this is Obama's war. It supports AQAP. There's a group in Yemen called the Giants Brigade. You could look them up. It's a bunch of jihadists that are paid off by the UAE to fight against the Houthi group there that this war is on behalf of and supports. These jihadist groups, the terrorists that actually want to do harm to America, that we don't need to be wasting money in the Middle East and meddling in these silly squabbles of the King of Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, if you're calling a Democrat, you might have better luck talking about Jamal Khashoggi, talking about the people of Yemen, and certainly what Biden promised to do on the campaign trail. All right, Connor. Moving on here, I got a couple stories on the situation in Russia or in Ukraine as well. Kiev seizes assets of Russian Orthodox clerics. I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute yesterday. Ukraine has ratcheted up its campaign against a branch of the Eastern Orthodox Church with ties to Russia. On the order of President Zelensky, 7 senior clerics from the Russian Orthodox Church will have their assets seized and face a ban on a range of economic and legal activities. During his nightly video address on Sunday, the Ukrainian president said, by decision of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, sanctions were applied against 7 people, adding his administration is doing everything to ensure the aggressor state does not have a single string of Ukrainian society to pull. And, on just to elaborate on this a little bit more, Connor, I saw today there was a pretty high-ranking Ukrainian official that was telling Ukrainian citizens not to see a ballet. I believe it was the Nutcracker, because it was written by a Russian composer. And, this is the level of absurdity we're now talking about, Connor, where you really do have to worry that, the Ukrainian government is looking to do something against its Russian minority population. They're really looking to purge the Russian culture from the Ukrainian territory. But, the problem with that is there's a lot of people in the Ukrainian territory that are a part of the Russian culture and want to be a part of the Russian culture, including attending, churches that are a part of the Russian East Orthodox that is, I don't know, loyal to, like, in the way that, like, if you are a part of a Catholic church in the U.S., then, the Pope is the lineage. Then if you're a part of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, then the lineage would be the Moscow parachute. And so, according to Reuters, the new penalties mean that 7 clerics will have their assets seized and are subject to a ban on a range of economic and legal activities, as well as a de facto travel ban. The vast majority of Ukrainians belong to the Eastern Orthodox churches, with many worshiping in parishes that take direction from the Moscow parachute. On December 1st, Zelensky announced that Kiev would attempt to expel all religious institutions with ties to Russia, arguing that the move would make it impossible for religious organizations affiliated with centers of influence in the Russian Federation to operate in Ukraine. The president went on to claim that the Russian Orthodox Church poses a threat to Ukrainian culture, saying, "We will never allow anyone to build an empire inside Ukraine's soul." He additionally denounced Ukrainians who continue to attend the alleged Russian-controlled parishes as succumbing to the temptations of evil. Kiev has conducted a series of raids on Russian Orthodox parishes and claims to have uncovered clerics attempting to subvert the Ukrainian government, though has provided little evidence to support its assertions. Nonetheless, Kiev has sanctioned 10 top clerics of the church last week, suggesting they threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Again, Conrad, this rhetoric is really concerning, and I think if it was coming out of anywhere but a U.S. client state, the U.S. government would, take exception to this kind of thing. Now, I got a couple articles here by Dave DeCamp. The first one, NATO chief says Russia relations can't be repaired even after fighting. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the trust between the West and Russia has been destroyed and that relations couldn't return to normal even after the fighting ended in Ukraine. Even if the fighting ends, we will not return to some kind of normal, friendly relationship with Russia. Trust has been destroyed, Stoltenberg said. I think the war had a long-lasting consequence for the relationship with Russia. Stoltenberg claimed that NATO tried to build good relations with Russia after the Cold War, but the alliance ratcheted up tensions with Moscow by expanding up to the Russian border. When NATO expansion began in the 1990s, George Kennan, the late American diplomat sided with crafting the containment strategy during the Cold War, said there was no reason whatsoever for bringing the alliance closer to Russia. And so, we have this very Western-centric narrative that, this is all Russia's fault, but obviously there's a lot more nuance that we've talked about on this show. And, I think this is inappropriate for Stoltenberg to say, in a way, Connor, of course, even if a ceasefire is agreed to, we're not going to return to February 23rd, no matter what agreement is signed with Putin. But, to say that we can't repair the relationship post war ending, I think is probably a signal to Russia that, we've had recent statements by Angela Merkel that, the former Russian or German leader, Ted Snyder, wrote about this at antiwar.com, that basically, she said that the Minsk agreement was just a tactic to delay until the Ukrainians were ready to fight against Russia. And, I think Russia is going to see it that way if the NATO says, they really have no plans to ever restore the relationship. Next article from Dave DeCamp, Ukraine says it needs $1 billion to quickly repair energy infrastructure. As Russian missile strikes have decimated Ukraine's energy infrastructure, Ukraine Ukrainian prime minister said Monday that Kiev needs $1 billion to restore its power grid and heating systems. The approximate cost of the urgent help from power sector stands at $500 million. The prime minister told the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. According to Reuters, the approximate cost of urgent help needed for centralizing heating sector stands at a further $500 million. And so it's not necessarily, Connor, that I don't think the Ukrainian people deserve to live in heat and have electricity. All this is very important. But at the same time, if the U.S. wants to make that happen, facilitating talks with Russia is probably the way to go. Judging by, how the war has been conducted so far, I don't think it's impossible that, they could even agree to scale back the war some to spare Ukraine's energy infrastructure if, say, Ukraine was, willing to scale back attacks within Russian territory. But, the U.S. is actually encouraging the opposite of that from happening at this point. So this is Zelensky's latest request. He wants natural gas and longer range weapons. And he told this to the Group of Seven, or the G7, on Monday. After the meeting, G7 leaders released a joint statement saying they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. So far, the U.S. has held off giving Ukraine longer range weapons, Zelensky cedes, but the Times reported on Friday that the U.S. is more likely to provide such arms now that it is tactically supports Ukraine's attacks within Russian territory. And I talked about that story on the last show. One more thing to bring about up on this is that there's a story out in the Times of London today, Connor, and I want to do a little bit more digging into this before I talk about it in too much detail, but I do want to mention here that they're saying that British Marines are carrying out operations deep within Ukraine's territory, so that would be a pretty significant escalation. Now, one more story here before I hand it over to you. The EU is preparing to send $19 billion to Ukraine. Of course, this is only half of the budget shortfall for Ukraine. Their non-military budget, I think, just for 2023. So they're probably going to be looking to the U.S. for another $19 billion. But at the same time, this is a big deal. And they got Hungary's cooperation on this. They had a lot of objections to all of this. So, Connor, tell us what's happening in Syria.
All right. So this one's from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on December 7th. This is Turkey sets deadline for SDF withdrawal from northern Syria. So Ankara has set a deadline for the withdrawal of the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces there, the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they're called, from areas of northern Syria close to the Turkish border. And this is from Al Jazeera. They're speaking to a Turkish source. So both Washington and Moscow are trying to avert Erdogan's ground invasion. There have been these artillery strikes and airstrikes for the last several weeks. But the source said Ankara is asking the United States and Russia to press the Kurds to withdraw. So Turkey wants them to leave the cities of Manbij, Tal Rifat, and Kobane within 2 weeks, or it will launch its ground operation it's been warning about and saying it's going to do for months and months now. Now, this article is from last week, so we're closer to the deadline there. And Ankara considers the SDF to be an affiliate, of course, of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which Turkey, the U.S., and the EU have labeled a terrorist organization. And Turkey has accused them of being behind this major bombing in Istanbul that killed 6 people and injured dozens more. Now, Axios reported on Wednesday that William Burns, the director of the CIA, has warned Turkey that these strikes that they're conducting in northern Syria are endangering U.S. troops that are stationed there in the seemingly permanent occupation of about roughly a third of Syria, which we'll get to here more in a minute. So Turkey has been threatening to launch the ground invasion, and they're seeking a buffer zone between its border and the SDF positions. So in response to Turkey's proposal, the Al Jazeera report says the U.S. suggested restructuring the SDF so that Arab members could be deployed to areas near Turkey. So the U.S. has about 900 troops in these SDF-controlled areas of Syria where they keep the territory out of the hands of Damascus. The U.S. paused its patrols with the SDF as a result of these recent Turkish strikes, but last week those patrols resumed. And the SDF has been wanting the U.S. to do more to prevent this Turkish attack, and they were even open to making a deal with for a more formal alliance with Syria, potentially with Russia acting as a mediator. But of course, the U.S. occupation complicates an arrangement like that. So the head of the SDF, Mazloum Abidi, told the Saudi newspaper Ashraq al-Assad that he wants the SDF to become a part of the Syrian government's army and is in talks with Damascus on the issue. All right, so this next one is about this is CENTCOM says 2 killed in raid against ISIS in eastern Syria. So this is again from Dave DeCamp on December 11th. So Central Command U.S. CENTCOM said in a press release that U.S. forces carried out a raid in eastern Syria early Sunday morning and killed 2 ISIS officials, as they said. And they named one of them as Anas and said the person was involved in, quote, the group's deadly plotting and facilitation of operations in eastern Syria. The command claimed no civilians were harmed in the raid, but of course, the Pentagon is infamous for undercounting civilian casualties, and very few details about this raid have been released. The U.S. has launched multiple raids and drone strikes against ISIS in Syria over the past few months. And despite Biden, of course, claiming, I think it was in a post-op-ed that he supposedly wrote, but saying that we're no longer engaged in combat missions in the Middle East, when, of course, we are still in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And the U.S. maintains an occupation force in eastern Syria of about 1,000 troops and backs the Kurds, as Dave points out here. And this is where, of course, where most of Syria's oil and wheat fields are located. It's part of the economic war against Syria. And so while on paper the U.S. presence is about fighting ISIS, as I say, it's really about enhancing the economic war and the sanctions policy, the Caesar Act sanctions, attacking the engineering sectors and the construction sectors, making sure that Syria can't rebuild here after 11 years of war. And so unhappy with U.S. efforts to prevent this ground offensive, the SDF, as I said earlier, is trying to negotiate a deal with Assad, with Russia as the intermediary. And as Dave points out, if the U.S. leaves Syria, the SDF, Syria, and its allies could cooperate against ISIS and wipe out what remains of it in these little pockets in the desert here in the eastern part of the country. And on top of the occupation, the U.S. maintains these crippling sanctions for the purpose of deliberately preventing them from rebuilding. That was Blinken said that last year, that our policy is essentially against the reconstruction of the country until there is a regime change, until Assad is no longer in power. And the White House reaffirmed that in October, saying they have no plans to leave Syria or ease sanctions. And last month, Alina Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, sanctions, went to Syria for a 12-day visit and subsequently spoke about the devastating humanitarian crisis the Syrian people are facing as a result of Washington's brutal economic war. And she said, in the current dramatic and still deteriorating humanitarian situation, as 12 million Syrians grapple with food insecurity, I urge the immediate lifting of all unilateral sanctions that severely harm human rights and prevent any efforts from early recovery, rebuilding, and reconstruction, Duhan told the UN Security Council. She said the catastrophic effects of unilateral sanctions are impacting people across all walks of life in the country, and noted that 90% of Syrian civilians live in poverty with limited access to food, water, healthcare, transportation, electricity, shelter, and fuel. And of course, we've discussed before on the show that rebuilding the country is going to take estimates are sometimes close to like $400 billion. And it's impossible to do, of course, with these sanctions, especially the Caesar Act, which attack anybody of any nationality attempting to even help them rebuild. I mean, it's specifically going after engineering and construction, making sure that they continue to live in poverty, crushed until like as if this would work, but until Assad is forced out of power. Now, here's this other one from Dave DeCamp on the 11th. Israel is, again, they've been escalating their bombing of Syria recently, and now they conducted missile strikes in southern Syria and then dropped a bunch of threatening leaflets warning that there's going to be more and more bombing. So Again, this is the Israeli military on Sunday dropping threatening leaflets in southern Syria hours after launching missile strikes in the area. The Israeli missile strikes took place late Saturday, with reports saying the strike hit a Syrian military radar system in an area of southern Syria known as Tel al-Khalib. Although the incident has not been confirmed by Syrian state media, which usually does the reporting on these operations. Now, the Israeli Defense Forces appear to take credit for the strikes and the leaflets that were dropped, which said, "Time after time, you have been responsible for the harm caused by your decisions." And this is being quoted in the Times of Israel. It continues, "The continuing presence of Hezbollah in the area of Tel al-Khalib and collaboration with it has brought and will bring you nothing good. The presence of Hezbollah in the area has brought you humiliation, and you are paying the price for that." Israel bombs Syria nearly every week, sometimes more. They've been particularly testing the Russians lately by bombing areas closer to where they have military assets in the far western part of the country. But of course, the IDF rarely acknowledges these strikes, and they're framing the operations as, of course, they're always going after Iran or Hezbollah. But I mean, they've been targeting civilian infrastructure. This year, they've hit the Damascus airport, the Aleppo airport, and often kill civilians and Syrian soldiers as well. And then there's a note here that Dave adds in the article that there's an Arabic newspaper based in London that reported on Sunday, citing unnamed Israeli political sources, that Tel Aviv has threatened Lebanon that they could soon bomb Beirut's international airport, because they're saying that there were allegations in Saudi media that Iran had used civilian flights to the airport to transfer weapons to Hezbollah. And that's mainly their justification. One of the things that the Israelis always say when they bomb Syria, that they're going after these weapons transfers from Iran via Syria to Hezbollah. And so... all right, so now we're going to move into some China news. This one's about the NDAA. This is from December 8th. This is from Dave DeCamp. NDAA includes unprecedented military support for Taiwan. So the 2023 National Defense Authorization includes this legislation that gives unprecedented U.S. military support to Taiwan, which, of course, Beijing will view as a major provocation, and just further part and parcel of the Biden administration's gutting of the one China policy. And so there's just more details here about this specific legislation, the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, as it's called. And we can sort of clarify here the differences between what we originally knew as the Taiwan Policy Act and what this ultimately this amendment actually looks like. So Bob Menendez, the ultra hawkish neoconservative Democrat chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said including the new support for Taiwan in the military spending bill will, quote, dramatically enhance the United States' defense partnership with Taiwan by establishing for the first time ever a specific defense modernization program for Taiwan. So this is the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act. It authorizes $2 billion in annual military aid for 5 years. This is in the form of foreign military financing. This is the State Department's program where they give foreign governments money to buy American weapons. Now, the U.S. has sold weapons to Taiwan since severing diplomatic ties with Taipei in 1979, recognizing Beijing. But it has never financed the purchases. Under the legislation, Taiwan will be allowed to use more than 15% of their foreign military financing funding to procure weapons from their own domestic firms. Now, of course, this amendment also includes this legislation also includes an additional $1 billion in annual military aid, but this will be from the Presidential Drawdown Authority, the PDA. This is the primary way the U.S. has been arming Ukraine, so they'll be sending weapons now to Taiwan directly from the Pentagon's stockpiles. And so what's particularly interesting here is that they're putting aside $100 million annually to create what they call a regional contingency stockpile for Taiwan. And besides this, the funding calls for more military cooperation between the U.S. and Taiwan and looks to increase Taipei's participation in international organizations. So essentially what they've taken out of the Taiwan Policy Act is this idea of giving them the benefits of being a, quote, major non-NATO ally. But there was already discussion about whether or not this would be they wouldn't do it overtly. It would be more like a de facto kind of a thing, so that it wouldn't, at least on paper, upend the one China. Of course, it would, but this is how politicians think. So if it's not, or if they don't do it overtly, then it's not the same thing. And also, there was a big part of the Taiwan Policy Act was this massive sanctions regime that was being planned if in the event of a subjective claim on basically, if there's an escalation in hostilities from China vis-a-vis Taiwan. It's very loosely worded so that you could justify them, like, say, simulating a blockade again would be based on some other, as in reaction to a further U.S. provocations, that they could justify implementing these sanctions as a result of that. So, and this would have hit key industries across the country and the whole political elite, including President Xi. So that's no longer included, but they are going to be, it sounds like, increasing, like I said, escalating Taipei's, the way they're represented in international organizations, which is, again, eroding the one China policy, and very provocative. So after the TPA was advanced by the panel, Rand Paul, of course, warned in his op-ed for the American Conservative that this policy and Biden's frequent pledges to defend the island and breaking strategic ambiguity makes war more likely. He says preparation for war may very well be the Chinese response to the Taiwan Policy Act and strategic clarity. If the United States announces an ironclad commitment to defend Taiwan prior to establishing the capabilities to do so, China may invade before the United States can significantly bolster Taiwan's military. So the NDAA was, of course, passed by the House last Thursday, and it's expected to be brought to the floor this week to be voted on by the Senate, and then it goes to Biden's desk. And last week as well, the State Department approved another $425 million arms sale for Taiwan for spare aircraft parts to support their F-16s, their C-130 transport planes, and other American weapons systems. All right. So, okay, so here's the next story. China discussed how to properly handle Taiwan differences with U.S. officials. And this is, again, from antiwar.com on the 12th. So there's been some reporting recently about this delegation of one State Department official, and then this Laura Rosenberger, who's sort of Antony Blinken's right-hand man on the National Security Council for China and Taiwan policy. And so they've gone over to China to basically lay the groundwork for Antony Blinken's visit there early next year. So this is China's vice foreign minister discussed how to properly handle differences over Taiwan with American officials who visited China for talks. And this is the Chinese foreign ministry is saying this yesterday. And the senior U.S. delegation that traveled to China for 2 days was led by Daniel Crittenbrink, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, and Laura Rosenberger, the Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the National Security Council. She's been a long time, like I say, right-hand man to Antony Blinken, going back to the Obama administration when he was, Deputy National Security Advisor and Deputy Secretary of State and this sort of thing. So the talks, let's see, Crittenbrink and Rosenberger met with Vice Foreign Minister Xi Feng in the Chinese city of Langfang. The talks followed a recent meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi in Bali. And now Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said that the U.S. visit that the two sides had in-depth communication on following through on the common understandings between the two heads of state in Bali, advancing consultations on the principles guiding China-U.S. relations, properly handling important and sensitive issues in bilateral relations, including the Taiwan question. So according to the South China Morning Post, the U.S. delegation, again, like I said, this is laying the groundwork for Blinken's visit. And while the U.S. and China have increased communication, we had Lloyd Austin recently meet with his Chinese counterpart in Cambodia. There were some constructive talks, apparently, between the respective climate envoys at a UN conference recently. The U.S. Has framed its engagement with China, however, as sort of managing of competition rather than attempts to resolve issues, even as tensions are boiling, of course, especially with the and of course the Taiwan Resilience Enhancement Act and all this. So now, I mean, so as far as that bill goes that we were just discussing, there's a good quote here from the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying that the U.S. must stop using Taiwan to contain China, stop military contact with Taiwan, and refrain from further undermining China-U.S. relations. So everything I've read so far, and it sounds like this was part of a whirlwind tour where they're visiting other countries in the region. I believe South Korea and Japan as well. Really, it would have been much better for the diplomats to go there. And maybe there are, people lower down the chain who are there, who are helping to actually thaw some, the relations to some extent. And actually, I don't see how they can really lay the groundwork and prepare for this visit early next year if they're in and out like that. So maybe there is more communication than we're being made aware of right now. Although all the reports are saying basically that nothing is really expected to come of this. There's not going to be any concessions made with respect to trade, with any significant concessions, obviously, with respect to Taiwan, let alone this buildup in the Asia Pacific, the Asia pivot, and all the provocations that we've been covering here since Biden came in, drastically escalating the confrontational military policy with China. That doesn't seem to be changing at all. So it's funny. I saw a comment in one of these articles in the South China Morning Post where I think Kurt Campbell, who's the architect of the Asia pivot, and again, this is the largest military buildup since World War II. The U.S. is attempting to encircle China with 2/3 of all naval and air forces. And so Campbell said, with everything that's happened this year with China and especially over Taiwan, he goes, I think both sides would like to see a sense of foster a sense of predictability and stability to this relationship. And this, one of these experts from China was being interviewed, and he's saying, I don't think China at this point wants to stabilize the current approach, which is entirely to their detriment. It would seem they would want to reverse that trend. So it's interesting how they're trying to raise tensions to such an extent and then, quote, stabilize. I don't think that's workable at all. Now, here's another one from Dave DeCamp. Japan to increase military budget by 56% over 5 years. So Japan is planning a massive boost in military spending that will increase its defense budget by 56% over the next 5 years to $318 billion. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida ordered his ministers to raise the spending levels. This is last week, in the latest sign that Japan is moving away from being a pacifist country, as outlined in its post-World War II constitution. Kishida made the order about a week after he announced he wanted to bring military spending to about 2% of Japan's GDP, the same level NATO wants all of its members to reach. Japan's military spending has typically been around 1% of GDP or less. And the U.S. has been encouraging Tokyo to increase military spending as part of their strategy, as part of Washington's strategy against China. And according to Kyodo News, President Biden told Kishida in a phone call in October 2021, when the Japanese leader first came into office, that the U.S. expects Japan to hike military spending. And the U.S. has been encouraging Japan to increase its military cooperation with regional countries. Earlier this year, Tokyo signed a deal with Canberra that will allow Australian and Japanese troops to deploy together, the first deal of its kind for Japan since the end of World War II. U.S. and Australian officials said recently that they will invite Japan to take part in more military exercises. Kishida said last year he wants to explore the option of giving Japan the ability to strike other countries, which would require amending his country's constitution, which says that Japan is only allowed to have a military for self-defense. But now, there's a report up at antiwar.com today, again from Dave DeCamp. This is Japan to buy U.S.-made Tomahawk missiles in another move away from pacifism. So Japan is set to purchase hundreds of American-made long-range Tomahawk missiles in the latest sign that they are moving away from the policy of pacifism since World War II. And this is from the Washington Post on Monday, which says that the purchase is going to give Japan long-range strike capability, breaking from their policy of only having weapons for self-defense. They are framing it, however, though, as necessary for self-defense because they're saying they need a counter-strike capability. With a range of over 1,000 miles, these Tomahawks can hit targets, easily hit targets in both China and North Korea. And American and Japanese officials have told the Post that Japan hasn't formally requested the Tomahawks yet, but the Biden administration supports the plan. And of Tokyo purchasing these missiles, which are incidentally manufactured by Raytheon. And the U.S. has been encouraging Japan to build up its military as part of this strategy against China. The Tomahawks are expected to take about 5 years to be delivered. The purchase would be part of Kishida's plan to more than double his country's military spending over the next 5 years. He says he wants to bring military spending up to 2% of GDP. If they reach that goal in 5 years, it would make its military budget the third highest in the world, behind only China and the United States, which is, of course, by far the biggest military spender. So Japanese officials told the Post that purchasing the Tomahawks and increasing military spending would assure the U.S. that they have a strong ally in Tokyo. Besides pushing Japan to boost its armed forces, the U.S. is encouraging Tokyo to increase its military cooperation with other countries. And of course, Japan is a member of the quadrilateral security dialogue with the United States, India, and Australia, which is the sort of would-be East Asian NATO. And they recently signed a military pact with the U.S. and South Korea at the Madrid summit, or the NATO Madrid summit earlier this year, really targeting North Korea. So they're going to continue to escalate tensions. And of course, the Raytheon is making more money here, and we don't really see. I don't see any. If there's one diplomat, the only possible person I could have less confidence in going to China to try and mend relations at this point than Antony Blinken is Mike Pompeo. Either way, I think we're in a pretty bad situation here. So it's going to have to, I think it's going to have to come from the bottom up. The American people are going to have to insist on some kind of détente here sooner rather than later, so we don't run into a similar situation as we see now in Ukraine.
All right, Connor, thanks for the report, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And just a quick reminder, if you can, head on over to the libertarianinstitute.org and make a donation. We are a tats whatever organization, so if it'll help on your taxes, send it to us rather than sending it to the federal government, and we really appreciate it. And we'll continue to produce great, anti-empire, anti-war, libertarian content. Thanks, Connor.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.